Hello, Internet, and welcome to another episode of Fifth Estate Live. I'm David Rovix, the host of the show. I do some kind of live stream broadcast every weekday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. Mondays are Pandemic Open Mic Mondays, and everyone is encouraged to participate. You can sign up at davidrovix.com/POMM for Pandemic Open Mic Mondays. Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays are discussions with David, where I interview my friends, generally folks I'd be hanging out with in person if I were still able to travel and play music like I used to do. Every Tuesday is Fifth Estate Live, hosted by me and produced by Peter Werbe, longtime member of the editorial collective of the Fifth Estate and also a longtime Detroit area talk show host. The Fifth Estate is a print publication that has taken many forms over many decades since it was founded in 1965. For a long time, it was a weekly newspaper. In its current form, it is a quarterly magazine. It's distributed to people both in and outside of prison, which is of particular note this week, and we'll talk more about that later. People can subscribe to the Fifth Estate at fifthestate.org. On the first two episodes of Fifth Estate Live, I interviewed two of the folks who contributed articles to the latest issue. Today, I was going to be talking with Cindy Milstein, but that didn't work out, so we changed the plan, and I'm talking with the producer of the show, Peter Werbe, who I am personally excited to have on because a lot has happened in the world since the last time we talked for the first episode of my Discussions with David series, which was on April 14th. Peter Werbe,
Hi, David.
welcome back.
Hi, everybody. I'm disappointed Cindy isn't here, but we'll get her on later.
We'll get her on.
She is a wonderful resource for anarchist theory and organizing. And so to those people who were expecting her, as the producer, I just have to say, well, you got me. Yes.
So, yeah, which isn't so bad, I think, no. Ending up with you. There's been, as I mentioned, a heck of a lot that's happened in the past 2 months since the last time we talked, and also a lot of stuff that is particularly relevant to anarchist theory, which you know something about, and also other subjects, which I don't know, we in terms of the some of the stuff I know that you have maybe been involved with thinking about in some writing that you've been doing, the whole question of that's been debated in the media very, very actively in the past couple of weeks of how they frame violence and nonviolence in terms of protest. Seems like there's a lot to talk about anyway. But I wonder, first of all, constant refrain of defund the police, which is a fascinating, wonderful concept, which seems very unlikely to happen. But what you got any thoughts on defunding the police, Peter?
Well,
Werbe?
part of the defunding the police is just mean they're going to take some of the money that they allocate. Where is it? Is it New York? They spend $1.6 billion on their army, their domestic.
I think so. I think it's like it's almost like half the budget of many cities for many cities. I didn't even realize that until just this week. Half of the budget. Are they destroying a house next door to you or something? Is there some massive construction project? That's not over here, is it?
Well,
that's
let me
on
tell
your
you
end,
this.
Right?
Yeah, my on-air partner when I did a talk show, Jillian Jordan and I, we used to broadcast from our homes. And one time, and I was broadcasting right from where I am now, and my neighbor pulls up and gets out of his car and takes a whiz right on the side of his house, which I narrated. But at least that was silent. But let's talk about the police to begin with. What's been exposed is what Ken Knabb calls a public secret, is that everybody knows that there's police brutality and police misconduct. If they deny it, they're either lying, a fool, or a racist, usually all three, right? Sometimes people are just ignorant. They're so, I don't know what, isolated that they don't know. But most everybody knows that cops regularly kick the crap out of people. Particularly among the white population, they deny it because they depend, they think, upon the police to protect them from the colored hordes that could invade their suburban sanctuaries. But now the secret's out and it's being made public. And I was just at a demonstration last night in Detroit, and I was amazed at how all these young people were chanting, that phrase, say their name. And they would say different people's names that have been murdered by the police. And that came to light because we have to remember there's probably thousands of particularly young black men that have been killed by the police since slavery that never have been reported or counted. And they were these young people, 16, 25, 30 years old, recounting the names within the last 50 and 60 years of men and women that were killed in Detroit, but also nationally as well. One thing that's missed, the police are also corrupt, and they're also, and this could be even more dangerous than their murderous activity, is they're perjurous. They commit perjury on a regular basis when they testify in court, condemning tens of thousands of innocent people, not just in high-profile murder cases, but in simple things. They lie about why they stopped somebody. They lied about that there was resistance or resisting arrest. They lie about evidence. And so you'd say, well, those are the bad apples. There's enough bad apples that it spoils the whole crop. And so the idea of reforming police in its traditional form is an impossibility. And there are certain places like the city in which I live, Oak Park, Michigan, that's 50% African American. You would think if there was a model police force, men and women trained in emergency medical service, fire, and police that have no lawsuits against them, that are committed from the top through the officers. The head of the police union is a liberal Democrat. You'd say, wow, what about Oak Park? But it's almost as if the exception proves the rule. I mean, they're a standout because they're not beating the crap out of people. They're not on the take. They're not lying in court.
It's a very low bar.
Yeah, exactly. So, and the idea of reform, I mean, I was interviewed by someone who's going to be our guest next week. This is all pretty, what do you call it, incestuous.
Peer-reviewed papers, kind of thing.
Steve Kirk, who's the publisher of Oak Journal, an anti-civilization magazine, brand new one, just first issue is out, a wonderful publication. He interviewed me and he said, look, anarchists are maximalists. We want revolution. We want the overturning of the capitalist economy and the political state that it's bolster. It's the foundation of which the economy can continue. So what do we do when there's a reform? And wanting the police to stop beating people up is a reform. But when you're secure, mostly, although I've been attacked by the police, probably you have too. If you go on a demonstration, they're political.
Then you're in another category. You're no longer in the category of white suburbanite or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, that as maximalists, if you could call us that, we still want, well, I don't know, whenever I say we, it's what people sound like the Catholic Church. But let me say we, as anarchists, we want reforms. I mean, if the essentially stripped down to what people are saying is don't beat us up, don't kill us, treat us as you treat white people, that's certainly a reform that we can get behind for a continually at-risk population that is insulted and humiliated every day by white society in general, the police being the most dramatic of it. The same thing, again, talking about reforms, is that we want to end the wage system, right? We want to add, commodity exchange and all that. But when someone's making $7.50 an hour, and there's a movement that says $15 an hour, which you can buy a cocktail for that at a fancy bar.
I mean, and even just also within the ranks of more of people that aren't systematically discriminated against for the color of their skin, there's also this fascinating division between people that don't seem to understand the difference between getting paid $7.50 an hour as opposed to $15 an hour, because they have been getting paid better than that for a long time, and it's not a relevant concept. But for those of us who are on the lower end of the income scale, yeah, these kinds of reforms, like the average life for the minimum wage worker in Denmark and the average life for the minimum wage worker in Michigan is like hard to overstate.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
no, that's just. I mean, I run across this as an anarchist in regular, regularly interacting with all sorts of people from all sorts of other backgrounds, including lots of people who sort of tend to equate all forms of capitalism with all other forms of capitalism. Mm-hmm. I always have to say that if you grew up in the United States, check out some other capitalist societies before you assume they're all the same, because there's lots
Sure.
of different nuances here, also in terms of how much it's involved with systematic discrimination against certain elements of society. That's also seems like a particular pandemic in the United States, as because of our particular history of slavery and genocide. It seems, I mean, it's not totally unique to the United States, but it takes a more severe form here, it seems like. And has for a long time.
Well, we're focusing very correctly so on the racial dimensions of police violence. One of the things when I was doing my talk show, people would say, well, there's not very much of it. And I'd say, just Google police violence videos. So, I mean, and that ought to be enough. But one of the things that isn't being perhaps addressed enough, and it is understandable, because what we're talking about is the murder of a man in a very horrible manner, and then stacking up along all the other bodies, other black bodies that have been murdered just recently, even. But poverty, because when we talk about abolish the police, I mean, societies with large poverty classes are very disruptive. They're violent. They have a lot of substance abuse and addiction. There's spousal and child abuse, mental illness. That comes with being poor, and it's nothing to do with skin color. Wherever poor people are, they exhibit behavior that seems destructive, and what people in the classes above them say, that's why you're poor. Well, that's not why they're poor at all. There's a structural class nature to capitalist society, obviously. And if you're in the poverty class, and you have a large poverty class, say like in Brazil, where the cops go in there in sixes with automatic weapons, kill a few people every night, particularly young kids, and then go out. That's what you can expect. But so you have to deal with, if you're even going to go reforms, you're going to have to do reforms that strike at the heart of poverty, that have people that aren't, again, so stressed, so desperate, so unhappy, so humiliated, have such a sense of low self-esteem, because we know if you're poor, you must have done something wrong, right? That's the message, because anyone can be anything in the society, which is a load of crap. I mean, including things like everybody needs a good education. If everybody had a PhD in French Renaissance history, you'd have people working for $7.75 an hour with a PhD, right?
Sure.
And you also have to have a sacrifice class, which is the poor class. I mean, who is going to work in a foundry unless they're willing to sacrifice their health? Who is going to do some of the the jobs of cleaning bedpans? And I mean, you could have that up as just as a service to for instance, the elders or the sick. But people are forced into those positions. So it's not addressed. And Michelle, I think it was yesterday, Michelle Alexander has written about the penal system. She wrote a book, The New Jim Crow, and she was talking about that. And this is good to hear too, because if the Republicans, the radical Republicans after the Civil War, would have continued with Reconstruction, we wouldn't be having this conversation today at all, because black skin would be no different than brown eyes.
Yeah, I often say if when people ask us, has there ever been a government in the U.S. That you would support? And I have to say those 2 years when the radical Republicans were the majority in the Congress were a pretty good 2 years.
Was that all? Because it went on. I mean, Reconstruction went on to what, 1876.
I think there were only 2 years when they were actually a majority in the Congress, but or had the majority. But then the Republicans were the majority for longer than that. But the radical Republican faction were in control of the Congress, I think, for 2 years. But now
and then,
I don't remember where I read that, but it was somewhere.
And this is instructive for what may be happening at the end of the election this year. The two candidates, the Democratic candidate, which was supported Democrats and supported slavery and opposed Reconstruction, and the Republicans, they had almost a tie, and they were both planning inauguration ceremonies. They both intended to install their candidate as the president. And the Democrats said, if you withdraw the federal troops that were protecting the freemen, the slaves that had been free, we will let the Republican assume the presidency, which is what happened. And that's when the Night Riders, that's when the KKK, that's when the White Terror drove black people that were slaves, had a few years of freedom, and drove them into peonage. Essentially, they became, peons. That is the very fact that that's brought up is good. But one of the things that Steve Kirk, the publisher of the Oak Journal, asked me, so what should anarchists do in situations like this? And I said, I'm getting more and more pleased to say I don't know. I mean, people go, whoa, man, you're supposed to know this stuff. You've been around a while. You write in the Fifth Estate. Shouldn't you be able to tell everybody what to do? Well, the answer to that is pretty obvious, particularly when I go out there and see, and know that 80% of the people or more are younger than me. And I just sit back and go for it.
But there is a lot of right. But there are a lot of experiences and also things that have happened that whether or not you or I or anyone else is alive today has experienced, but a lot of things that have happened in the past that are relevant to draw on for the current moment. But one thing maybe it's just in my own little mental space here because I'm so obsessed with rent striking, and the which is obviously an ongoing thing, but it's also so much of the economy and so much of what so many people are burdened with dealing with all the time every month, coming up with rent, especially in the lower end of the economy, and it occurs to me that if the police departments were defunded, the first thing that would happen would be all those people who are spending 80% of their income on rent would if there's no more risk of forced evictions, and then there's a de facto suspension on evictions, then that would be the first thing that would happen would be a whole lot of corporations that who are based on owning real estate would start going under, and a lot of people would have disposable income that they didn't have to pay for real estate for rent. I mean, it would be the disruption to the whole economy with the concept of defunding the police is so extreme that I just find it's fascinating that it's even being discussed, because I mean the implications are just immense.
Well, here, I'm looking at the CNN. Don't get more mainstream than that. And it's talking about Camden, New Jersey. They disbanded the police department. Here's what happened next. And crime dropped, brutality dropped. And there's a number of cities that have abolished their police forces because they become so entrenched and oftentimes such a racket. And, what most of the cops think, again, what I said at the beginning was that the model that we have now is probably incapable of reform. I mean, we always talk about the police union, which shouldn't even be in the union movement. I mean, think how
Right.
many times
That's horrific.
people in the police union have attacked unionists. I mean,
Mm.
that should be enough from their, being expelled.
But in
But
Camden, when they get rid of the police department, what is it? Are they replaced with state police? Is that how it
uh,
works? Is that like there's? It's not that they don't have armed
no, right.
people
There has,
enforcing laws.
well, you've been to Cuba? I forgot.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Well,
Camden.
whoop, wait a minute here. Let me get rid of that. Sorry. Well, one of the things you may know is that they, I'm not a big, in fact, this is an understatement. I'll make it more positive. I'm not a fan of the Cuban government at all. But they, for instance, within the social structure of the neighborhoods, they have something called Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. Some of their activities is pretty odious because they want to keep a lid on any political dissent, and then if you get too out of hand, they report you to the real cops. But on the other hand, they even have more dispersed groupings. Like they have women's groups, they have elder groups, and what have you. And if you're beating up your wife, the women's committee will come to you and say, comrade, we have heard reports that you're abusing your wife, and this is absolutely unacceptable. It's opposed to the principles of the revolution. And can we get a guarantee for you to stop? If you have abuse problems, we can direct you here. If you have emotional difficulties or need counseling, we can provide this. But we do not want to get another report of any abuse. And 10 Cuban women telling you can't do this anymore. That often it. Then it could go up to the level of these committees for the defense of the revolution. And if you really become involved in what they consider correctly antisocial behavior, then the cops will come. But we call Cuba a police state, which it is. And I've been there 4 times, and I rarely ever saw any police at all.
Yeah, right. Hardly ever.
Yeah. The other thing is we can invent new forms, right? We're not locked in by this structure that came about from the slave patrols, that from their origins, even the coppers in New York in the 1840s that were, or like the Brazilian or Philippine cops today, and exacted that kind of tribute through corruption and violence towards people they designated as perpetrators. So that's what I mean. I don't have a lot of advice, or I don't even in a way want to say, here's Camden as a model. I don't want to in any way say, here's the limits within which you should make a decision.
Right. No.
The other part of it is, I don't think any of these young people would listen to me, and that's great.
And we don't, and the future is unwritten, and we have no idea what's going to happen. But some of the things that have that movements have encountered in the recent past and further back that are going to be that people are from as far as I can tell dealing with right now in all sorts of ways is the many underhanded methods of disrupting movements that the authorities and the media will engage in, and one of those ways that they are, it seems, very working very hard to disrupt things is to talk about the difference between, as they frame it, violent and nonviolent protests, and to me it seems extremely important thing that they're trying to do, and that they hopefully don't succeed in doing, because the way they're framing it, as far as I can tell, is nonviolent means ineffective and violent means anything else, and they're not framing it in terms of like actual violence as defined by any kind of dictionary. Like, I mean, marching in the streets is always something that they frame as something that is basically violence or inviting violence. Even though it's clearly in the pantheon of nonviolent civil disobedience in terms of a strategy, marching in the streets, I mean, or blocking a street, or blocking or occupying a building. These are all tactics engaged in by movements that define themselves as nonviolent, although they were often attacked by the police, like Martin Luther King's civil rights marches and such. But they're being attacked for the same kinds of tactics are meeting the same kinds of attacks by the police, and then being defined by the media as clashes. And I wonder just what you got, any commentary you got on that, because I know it's something you've been encountering for a long time.
Right. You don't know. First off, you don't know who's who. We've seen, I don't know if you've seen these video footages of cops breaking windows in police cars. They exposed one cop, I think it was in Minneapolis, was doing something. Then there's these right wingers that have infiltrated the movements, the marches, and done stuff. And then there's some of our comrades that whenever they get a chance just start breaking windows. And normally I don't have any problem with that in general, and telling them not to do it because it's bad optics just makes you sound like one of the people they think are part of the problem, holding back militancy and a radical willingness to break rules. In this one, particularly when Black people are at risk, I think comrades should be very circumspect about what acts they carry out and how they begin to define a movement that is about Black people. And one of the things that they made a lot of in Detroit is that 3/4 of all the people that got arrested were from the suburbs of Detroit, which is, and I don't know what to say. I assume the majority of those from the suburbs were white, although not necessarily. Last night, I was at a rally or a march, and then a rally that ended at the site of the Algiers Motel, which was where in 1967 in the Detroit uprising, cops executed 3 teenagers, and there was a man that got up and said, you can be from the suburbs. I don't care if you're from the suburbs, but if you're an anarchist, we don't want you here. If you're an arsonist, we don't want you here. So he said, anarchists and arsonists, go home. So I thought, well, I've been here long enough anyway. So I left. But most of my comrades stayed. They said, where are you going? I said, I'm going home. Anarchists are this boogeyman. Like, they tried to raise Antifa. Who's the most prominent Antifa in all of history? General Dwight W. Eisenhower, right? So it obviously, I think maybe somebody had a Antifa patch on or something like that. But there was a lot of damage, and there was a lot of looting. And I consider that to be, social vengeance, if you will.
But Peter, have you noticed how in many cases I've heard, and this is not new either, it's very consistent with reports from other incidents over the past several decades, but it seems to be what I gather is a fairly consistent thing I keep hearing is that when there has been actual looting and breaking of windows going on, the police have been absent, and what they've been attacking are people marching in the streets, not looting, not breaking windows, and that's when crowds of people are being violently attacked by the police.
Sure.
But anyway, that's not to say sort of changing the subject in a way, but of course there has been all this going on.
The cops love it. It's the more destruction they feel becomes more of a rationale for them existing, because Trump has taken this defund the police and said no, I support the police. So.
It's ammunition.
Oh
yeah, let's do no. I'll you can save us the trouble. You are listening to Fifth Estate Live. You're tuned into Fifth Estate Live broadcast that happens right here on whatever platform you're watching it on at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. You can watch it on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance and Cable Community Radio, and you can find out more about the Fifth Estate and subscribe to the print magazine at fifthestate.org. I'm talking with Fifth Estate Collective editorial collective member and longtime Detroit area talk show host Peter Werbe, who's also the producer of Fifth Estate Live. And I'm David Rovix, your host for this program.
And next week, we're going to have Steve Kirk, the publisher of the old journal, An Anti-Civilization. You know, I told Steve, I said, either the Fifth Estate, which publishes a lot of anti-civilization stuff, as well as class struggle and anarcho-syndicalism. I mean, don't have this, real narrow focus of things that the Fifth Estate, in talking about the COVID virus, we should say, we were right, I mean, what our Earth First comrades say, nature bats last.
Mm-hmm. And this is clearly one of those consequences of not only sort of modern civilization, but the particular inequities of this period in modern civilization. I mean, one of the things that is often being mentioned is how pandemics are more something that have historically happened at times when civilization is at a peak of inequality. Peak inequality, and which we're at now in terms of it's the most stratified society has been on the planet, I believe, since the age of the robber barons, and certainly in the United States, and I think globally it's worse in terms of the inequality of the current period. But this was also true of other plagues in the past, where there's been massive poverty and extreme concentration of people living in ghettos and refugee camps without running water, or et cetera, et cetera.
Well,
obviously,
been like that for the last 1,000 years in the West, as people began coming off of the land, either oftentimes forced off of the land, and then 500 years ago, starting with the enclosures, and these they talk about all these white supremacists, William Mozart and Einstein and all that. Well, they also had these cities that were these cesspools of disease and the worst possible living situations imaginable. But we miss things when we're talking about rent and withholding it and all that. I mean, that's why I think so much of your songs are so important. I mean, first off, it has to be good music, which you easily accomplish. But then, and I think I've said to you before, I'm always amazed that you can take an historical event that no one's ever heard of before and compress it into 3.5 or 4 minutes. So when you come out of it, not only do you learn about some rent strike in New York, Upper New York State in the 1840s against the Rensselaer family, but then it's got this anthemic end. Who gave you the right to be a landlord? And that's the only line, I mean, because you're telling a story, that's the only line I remember. And that's so fundamentally radical in the sense of extreme and going to the root. Because how did that happen? How did we all not become free, autonomous people linked together with a beloved community, and instead have some of the worst people in the world controlling the work we do in the world, and what kind of place we live in, and whether we get water and all that? I mean, that something's wrong here.
How is it that we are basically still living in a feudal society? I mean, that is, our basic relations in the society are still so much defined by these feudal relationships, where there's nothing sort of voluntary or democratic or any of that stuff about it. When they say we live in a democratic society, but not in the workplace, and not between your tenant and your landlord, and so many other things don't seem to be it doesn't seem to work that way in terms of the one person, one vote, or whatever these fantasies are.
A friend of mine who worked in a small machine shop got caught by the boss putting up a banner saying, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter." And
Yeah.
he was gone. Like that. But one of the things, just a little, if you will, get back to the maximalist anarchist position that we want to abolish the state, we want to abolish capitalism, wage work, the whole edifice of what has been on the agenda of civilization for the last 4,000 years, rulers and ruled. I mean, that increasingly sounds preposterous. 100 years ago, or more, the IWW, the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world were about, there were communists, well, yeah, even communist movement 100 years ago, socialist movements, unions that were, attacking capital in a very powerful manner. And now, though, if you say, "Oh, I'm an anarchist," people either think, you want to destroy things, or that's nice. You can say you're anything, because I say I'm an anarchist. I say it publicly. I used to say it on my mainstream radio broadcast, and I'm sure in many ways it just seemed like cool or an affectation. I could say I'm anything, right? I'm a white, middle class, older male. I get away with anything, as long as I don't try to act on those principles embedded in that thoroughly revolutionary critique and vision. But the vision is slipping away. And we had one person who gives great support to the Fifth Estate through the donations, say that we have to stop calling ourselves anarchists, the way that Fred Woodworth, this cranky old ex-anarchist from, anyway, Arizona. What's the big city there? Tucson.
Phoenix, Tucson.
Tucson, yeah.
Because it's like too much of an alarm bell word. I mean,
no, because of everything associated with it. And so this person, who's a very good, he distributes the Fifth Estate, and he said we ought to call ourselves bioregionalists. And I said, well, part of in 1984, Orwell's amazing book. If you have, every once in a while, I think I haven't read it in about 20 years. I go back and read it. If you haven't read it through high school, it nails it. And they had Newspeak, where they had this language that Big Brother was developing to secure his tyranny, what we sometimes call the tyranny of the fact. I mean, this is what we have, this system, and we should try to tinker around the edges to get rid of the worst stuff. But ultimately, it's capitalism, it's the state, it's hierarchical, even patriarchal. They're willing to give that up as long as it's hierarchical. So one of the things that Big Brother did is you eliminated words, which eliminated the concept, right? So you get rid of anarchism and you have bioregionalism. Well, and I'm all for, people give me, I always feel, I don't know what it is. People give me the peace sign, man. I always go, yeah, whatever.
Hey, what do they mean? What does that mean for them?
I don't know. I mean, my hair is not that long. I mean, maybe they think
you got a hint of a beard. I guess enough of a hint of a beard, they think you're a hippie.
Right on. Power to the people. Yeah. Power to the people. They were chanting that last night at the demonstration in Detroit. I'm all for that.
Yeah. Peter, you were talking earlier about the bizarre contrast between this whole reality in the past few months for so many different people in the world, how for many of us, and somebody's commented on not YouTube, but like for many of us, the hardest thing we have to deal with is the fact that our favorite local restaurant is closed, or whereas for other people it's life and death situation. Sure. And then you're talking about how being a white middle class anarchist is another form of that question too, I suppose.
Yeah. In my little town of 30,000, I mean, it's we're in white suburbs. My little town of Oak Park is considered Detroit because it's 50% African American, and only the fabled 8 Mile Road is this borderline between us. So in our city that had the highest rate of infection and death in the county in which we live, was the city is, as it often is, split. The west side of the city is about 80% African American, and this side is about 20%. I mean, won't believe you guessing about which side I live on, and which was just sort of an accident of, well, whatever. With discrimination and segregation, it's hard to plead accident. But anyway, 55 people died on the west side of Oak Park, and I haven't heard of anybody on this side. And you go 2 or 3 blocks away. You've been here and you've walked with me. You remember walking into this upscale neighborhood, Pleasant Ridge, it's upper middle class. The homes are, well, depending on where you're listening, it's probably no big thing. But for around here, it's expensive.
Yeah.
400,000 or 500,000, where our house is probably worth 120,000 or something like that. You would go out, even at the height of all this, and the height of the fear and the caution and everything, and it looked like every day. It looked like a nice Sunday. When it was warm, families would be out walking, bicycling, rollerblading, and walking dogs. So it turns out to be somewhat of an inconvenience for white middle-class people, unless you're trapped in New York City in high rises. I've talked to my friends there, and it's a nightmare and really frightening. I don't know what it's like in Portland. If it has, I mean, you're in an apartment, right?
Yeah, but the population density, even with the apartments, is still very low around here, I would say. But it's also a question of who's not just population density, but also what kind of things people do for a living, and then how dense the population is in a particular house, I suppose, because so many people are living, so many people in one 2-bedroom apartment or small house or that sort of thing as well.
Well, as I said, so it turns out to be an inconvenience. You can't go to bars, you can't go to restaurants, and what have you. And also, I mean, what's happening here is homes are so cheap. My wife and I bought this house years ago when if my income was in the upper working class, I would be surprised. But I mean, our house, and it was a while ago, was like $40,000. So, it was a few decades ago. But, it's huge spaces between the houses and, big leafy streets like, any Midwestern suburban city. But we know who's facing this the most. Also, when you go into the city of Pleasant Ridge, there are so many signs that say, "We salute frontline workers. Thank you, frontline workers. Thank you, essential workers. Thank you, essential workers." And I looked at them and I think, they're not essential workers. They're lawyers and stockbrokers and insurance agents and sales reps and stuff like that. They're not essential at all. But they're in these 4,000 square foot homes where these people on the west side of Oak Park are living in 900 square feet homes, the size of their living room, and contracting COVID and dying, since they're people of color, at a disproportionately high rate. I mean, I don't mean to berate them, because if they didn't have any signs, you'd say, they don't even realize, you can't win. I mean, you shouldn't win.
Yeah, but if they supported doubling the wages of essential workers or giving essential workers a universal basic income, it would be a little more convincing than just saying,
they might be. They might.
Yeah, maybe they do.
They're very liberal. This is, it's very interesting. The area around here, right in Oak Park where we live, the Ferndale, fabulous Ferndale, where the Fifth Estate box number is that you can subscribe at, or go to fifthestate.org and
yes, we are. Incidentally, this is Fifth Estate Live, where this is your host, David Rovix. We're talking with Fifth Estate Editorial Collective member Peter Werbe, and this is broadcast every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, and you can subscribe to the Fifth Estate at fifthestate.org. And I wanted also to, speaking of the Fifth Estate, and also which goes out to a lot of prisoners as well as people who are in what they call minimum security. The 2 days from now, on the 11th of June, is International Day in Solidarity with Political Prisoners. Is it?
It is.
Is that a
Anarchist,
UN thing?
long
Or,
term. If you go to june11.org, june11.org, it's, and I don't have it in front of me, but I think the long name is International Day of Solidarity with Marius Mason and long-term anarchist prisoners. And so there's lots of activity that of support of prisoners worldwide, and in this case of political prisoners. Marius Mason, for those that don't know, former Detroiter and Fifth Estate staff member, is serving 22 years for protecting the environment in acts that were deemed illegal. I mean, burn stuff, wreck stuff, stuff that was destroying the environment. It's interesting. I went to the sentencing in, where was it? Lansing. That's interesting. I can't. It was so long ago. It was over 10. He's been in prison for over 10 years, but it was either in Lansing or Grand Rapids, and the judge excoriated him, saying that this was the ultimate in anti-democratic actions, that there is a process for determining policies. It's called elections. You get your representative in there. And he naturally didn't want to offend the judge, although he might have done what, what's her name, Ann Hansen did, thrown a tomato at him, given the sentence he meted out. But where's the democracy when you're releasing GMO vegetation into the biosphere? Once it's there, the debate is over, right? What are you gonna do when you chop down old growth redwoods to make chipboard or rich people's patio decks? Where's the democracy there? I mean, those are acts that once they're done, they're gone. And the other thing about that, one of the things about Marius, he and his husband at the time were in the upper part of Michigan. Michigan looks like a, which way does it work? I don't know. I'm looking at it backwards anyway. But anyway, it looks like that. And they were up around here, and they would call demonstrations, and 14 people would come out to them. I didn't come out. I mean, 200 miles away, but people in the area didn't respond. If there would have been 50,000 people at some of these sites that were polluting or draining aquifers or any number of other campaigns that they undertook, well, they wouldn't have they wouldn't have needed to go to the direct action of burning stuff and destroying stuff. But
and that could have been, I mean, it's like now that things are happening the way they are, it seems like this, how else could anything have played out? But it's also true that in so many ways, society is and was on a precipice, and the reaction against the end of the world could have taken all kinds of different forms, including, and it still might, including an uprising around the destruction of life on Earth. But who knows? But it's. It would be a reasonable response to have an uprising around the planet around this question of survival.
Well, who knows now? The sky is literally the limit. Who would have thought, given all the other blatant police murders, that it would have been this one thing that not only tripped a mass response, but that spread all over the world, that 20,000 people would protest in Montreal because a man was murdered in Minneapolis, where other men were murdered previously. But that happens. These social explosions are inexplicable. I mean, Marxists always, they have the scientific analysis, which is just bullshit. They're usually wrong anyway.
They're always wrong. I mean, I don't know. At least
Yeah.
it seems to me that I don't know of a sort of a public intellectual from any political persuasion that has ever made an accurate prediction about some kind of movement of this
No,
nature. Do you?
no,
No.
no, and it's bad form. I mean, it's it is it limits. I mean, the whole idea. I mean, Marxism, it made some obvious critiques of capitalism, and well done. And I mean, you ever get these Marxists? Just like a Christian, instead of saying, "Have you read your Bible?" Have you read all of Marx? I said, "I've read every single thing that he's ever written, all 3 volumes of Capital and the Grundrisse." And they went, "Really?" And I said, "Of course not. I haven't read any of it. Why would I?" And they go, "Well, how do you understand capitalism?" I said, there's a Leonard Skinner song, horrible band, but they have a song called "I Know a Little." You know that? And the kicker line is, "I know a little and I can guess the rest." I mean, we live in capitalist society. If you don't want to admit what the real nature of it is, and if you can't envision a better way of living in this world, I don't know what to say.
What is, but that is that hits upon something that I often think about, and I think that is especially relevant right now, which is the question of being able to imagine a different society than this one, because it's a time when there's a lot of that going on, a lot of imagining going on, and yeah, it's ideas can take a powerful form when they become popular, but it's not a question so much. But what
Well,
I mean, there were a lot of good ideas floating around decades ago too.
yeah, somebody played. I don't remember what I was listening to. Played a Martin Luther King talk, and I'm thinking, wow, did he just record that today?
Right.
Because 50,
Totally.
more than half a century later, we're looking at the same problem. What is, the capitalist class, I think, realizes that public commotions are not good for business, and oftentimes they try to ameliorate it by, okay, women are giving us a hard time, and we got to stop calling them chicks and looking at their legs and let them, participate more fully in society and reduce the patriarch considerably. Well, it's reduced, over the last half century, it's been reduced considerably, but discrimination against women, rapes, all this stuff is not anywhere near this period, and to some extent, it's still at a pandemic level. So we're these ameliorative reforms. Sure, well, I hope they happen, but they sure don't solve the problem, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, well, I don't know what that tells us. Just, well, there's an old civil rights thing. Keep on pushing, and I don't know what more we can do. But it's heartening. The other day, I don't know whether this is everywhere, but they have around here. They have car caravans. So we that's done other places.
Yeah, that's happening all over, I think.
So there was this one that went from Detroit out to this very wealthy suburb called Birmingham, and Birmingham, Michigan. And so at the end, I left, and I was driving down Woodward, the main street, back to Detroit, and suddenly there's like 2,000 white kids from Birmingham blocking the street. And I'm going, holy crap! Who would have thought? I mean, sure that everyone is revulsed by when they see these scenes of these cops, executing this man on the street, but even beating people up and hitting people like people are going to police brutality protests, and the cops are beating the shit out of people. I mean, these guys are, hopeless in terms of altering their behavior. I mean, where was I? Oh yeah, New York. Chokeholds were illegal when that guy, I can't think of his name now, choked Eric Garner.
And now they've made them illegal again. As if, I mean, it's like we're repeating history. Like I heard them talking about the governor talking about banning chokeholds again. Like, wait, didn't you just do that 5 years ago? Anyway, yeah, this is
Well,
The
so it's
repetition, sometimes you don't have to wait a whole generation for it.
so we can hope that these reforms take a greater have a greater influence on police behavior. I don't think we've seen the backlash yet. I think we saw a little bit of it in Buffalo, where those 57 cops resigned from that unit. There was in, I don't know, 1919, I think it was, there was a Boston police strike. Um, you're nodding. You probably have a song about that.
No, but this backlash question, Peter, is one that it's relevant to mention, I think, because a lot of people are talking about it. And like in Europe, a lot of people have been asking me, is there going to be a civil war in the United States? And then I'm always wondering, well, I don't know, but what would be the lines for a civil war? What would be, what would that be like?
I don't know. That's what I always say. Who are they going to fight? It's not. They're armed. The right wing is armed. We're not. We're not armed. Might have the John Brown Rifle Society, if I'm saying the name correctly. But I'm sure 90% of the semi-automatic rifles are in the hands of nutcases or racist nutcases. So I'm counting if that ever happens. And here, this is what you're forced into. On the 82nd Airborne, an integrated unit that usually, is over, across the ocean, killing people of color, taking on these right wingers and dispatch them because we don't have the capacity to resist, an armed right wing mobilization. I'm searching around for a word because what are they going to do? They're going to march on Washington,
The right. I mean, they kind of already run Washington, so it would be a little weird to. I mean, at least people also have asked, why is there not a bigger, more well organized right wing in the United States? Because it seems like it's often better organized in many other countries, and I think here it's pretty common knowledge that if you want to be if you want to go around, committing racist murders with impunity, you just join the police force. You don't need to,
Yeah, and usually fascism comes about when there's a crisis in capitalist society, and the only crisis is being created by the people at the top at this time. That's why I think the most forward-thinking people want to get this nutball Trump out of there and get a regular American president in there that will do what he's supposed to, and not create constant turmoil. Turmoil is bad for business. This, what's going on now is bad for business.
But it's also good if you're trying to create a fascist dictatorship. I mean, it seems like a lot of what he's doing is kind of out of a familiar playbook, isn't it?
I don't know who wants a fascist dictatorship, except maybe him.
Seems like he does.
Well, he may, but he's, there's something truly disturbed about the man. But the people running things, the corporate heads, and I suspect most of the military do not want that.
No,
they'd
rather stability.
Yeah, that comes about when there's huge forces from the left looking to dismantle society. But the most recent example, not going back to the 30s, of course, is 9/11, that being 1971, right, in Chile. When a tepid socialist government took over, and that was enough for the U.S., and they installed a fascist government that ran for 18 years. But now it's not they call the radical Democrats, that it would be, but they're not even close. They're at best centrist with a few left progressives in it. That still increasingly, if you watch MSNBC or CNN, if you can stand it, who affirm the military, who affirm the former heads of the CIA and the national security councils and stuff like that. That's suddenly the liberal heroes. Whereas their crimes, almost makes you want George Bush back as president. Yeah, the guy and Colin Powell, they're saying, oh, that was so great. He denounced. Yeah, this is the guy that he accused Trump of lying.
Yeah,
this is the guy whose lies in the UN about Iraq having weapons of mass destruction has resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands. These two guys belong in the international tribunal, in The Hague, for war crime. And I know we're almost out of time, and you were just about to ask me about my
Oh, your
T-shirt.
T-shirt. That's exactly right.
Right.
Which at fifthestate.org, you can go to get the wonderful Fifth Estate T-shirts and look good at those protests.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things that's nice, which way do I go here? This drawing is by Stephen Goodfellow, non serviam. I will not serve, I will not obey. So that's and that logo has been on the cover of the Fifth Estate for, I don't know, could be even 30 years now. Yeah.
Excellent. Peter Werbe, part of the editorial collective of the Fifth Estate. Thank you very much for joining me for the hour.
Sure.
And,
glad
yeah.
to. And next week, Steve
and
Kirk.
next week, Steve Kirk.
Yeah, from the Oak Journal. You can go to, I think it's oakjournal.org and get a peek. Okay, and hopefully the guest that I booked will be there, and I will
We'll see. Otherwise,
we'll get Cindy Goldstein in soon.
Yeah.
All right, absolutely. David. Love you. Talk to you soon.
Love you. Take care,
Bye-bye.
Peter. Bye-bye. And this has been another episode of Fifth Estate Live, a weekly show live streamed on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, Cable Community Radio, and elsewhere, hosted by me and produced by Peter Werbe. You can subscribe to the print magazine at fifthestate.org. All of the live stream broadcasts I do, discussions with David, Pandemic Open Mic Mondays, and Fifth Estate Live, are archived in video form on various platforms, including in the Discussions with David playlist on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/drovics. They are also all archived in podcast form if you look for This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform. You can also find all these broadcasts in both video and audio form if you sign up to my email list at davidrovics.com or follow me on Patreon at patreon.com/davidrovics, where you can also support my efforts financially. People who become patrons also get access to a bunch of exclusive material only for them, such as my 16-part audio memoir. I have a new album out on Bandcamp, which anyone can stream for free, which will eventually be up on all the usual streaming platforms, called Notes from a Failed State. Tomorrow, I'm looking forward to talking with my longtime touring partner, songwriter, poet, author, and organizer from the south coast of England, John Bain, a.k.a. Attila the Stockbroker. Defund the police, don't pay the rent, and don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. Talk to you soon.